Good. All right, Flask. So we are, well, we just finished covering databases and CSVs and how to manipulate data, right? We now want to take things a step further and see how we do that utilizing a backend, specifically backend framework like Django and a server like Flask, which is a very simple application. It basically communicates with a database. You set up views to either give the users access to API endpoints that will hit this database or to update data that will then be rendered in a browser. So let's see. Let's talk about Flask for a sec. What is Flask? It's a micro web framework. It's written in Python, so it works well for the curriculum. And it's called a micro web framework because it's very light. It doesn't require a lot of tools or libraries. So it's very useful to use on the fly if you're just, let's say, building out a new application, right? And you're not entirely sure what kind of functionality you want to create. It's also fast, very easy to set up, very quick. It's great to just remember as a tool that you could possibly use when you're like, let's say, I don't know, Dockerizing an app or setting up an EC2 and an application on that EC2. So let's see. With that, we're going to switch over to our VS Code. We've got a terminal. We're going to do everything from scratch. And let's get started. All right. So you should already be familiar with how a server works. Basically, in a web application, there is a front end, the thing that you're interacting with via a browser. And it consists of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which we'll cover a little bit more next week. And it interacts with the backend server. So when a client sends a request to the server processes that request via APIs and then sends back a response. So this is where I think we talk about what REST is, RESTful API. I don't know if that's going to be covered this week. We might push that off till next week, but it's generally a pattern, right? A pattern of how you communicate between a front end and a back end. You send requests to the back end from the front end, and the back end sends responses back to the front end. So for our project, we're going to start off by creating a virtual environment like usual. I am going to make a new directory and call this Flask server. So let's cd into that. I think a lot of the readmes tell you to run python -m v and that folder name. You could totally do that. You could also cd into that folder just like I did and do a python -m v, pass in a period to pass in the argument of the present working directory. It's a relative path. It just basically says, make where I am a virtual environment. So with that, if you do an ls afterwards, you'll be able to see your bin folder, and that's what you want to activate. All right, we've got our virtual environment. So now we can start installing some of the stuff we need, like Flask. Very quick. It took, I don't know, 3 seconds to install. Really lightweight. Hence the term micro web framework. We're going to start by writing some code. What should I name this? I'll just name this flask.py. Very creative, you know. We are going to start by importing from Flask. Import Flask. And we're also going to import JSONify because JSON is just a very widely used format, and especially for front-end rendering. So retrieving data from a database and using JSON, or let's say converting it to JSON, makes it very malleable, very easy to CRUD. From here, we want to create or instantiate our Flask application. So let's assign it to a very basic variable of app. And we're going to say Flask, which we've imported. And we're going to pass in this name, this Python structure. We are then going to say if name, you don't have to do this step, but we're going to do it just so you know what it is and so we could talk about it a bit. If name equals main, a colon, because it's Python, app.run debug equals true. Can anyone tell me what this does? I know it really is a little cryptic. I've always my first time being exposed to this, I just had no idea what the hell it was supposed to mean, but it's actually fairly simple. At least I only know the surface level of it. It allows us to run this only as a script, right? So if we were to import this file in another Python file, this code block will not run. It will only run if we call this script, flask.py, from our terminal. So that's what we're doing. It's basically just a way to limit the running of this code block. From here, we want to, I think we're actually good to go. Let's see if we can run this from our terminal. So let's say it's called flask.py. We're going to do Python flask.py. Oof. And let's see. It's telling me I have a cannot import name Flask from partially initialized module Flask. I wonder if it's because it wants us to, no. Let me reload. And let me try this again. Nope. Just so we could see that error message. Why are we getting our, did I forget anything? I did a pip install Flask, right? Already satisfied. Flask.py. Let me double check the file that I made yesterday when I ran through this. Looks the same to me. I don't see, unless anyone sees anything I'm missing. I don't see anything wrong with this. Let's try going ahead and creating the route. We're going to create a route or a view because that's what we were going to do anyway. I wanted to show how if you do this part without creating a view first and you go to your browser, you'll get an error saying that nothing is loading. But let's do it this way. So dev index, what we're doing now is we're using this this construct app.route. We're passing it the path, the URL path basically that gets appended to the end of our base path. The base path in this case being localhost : port 8000. And then we're going to create a method that's going to be called when the user hits this endpoint. And in our case, what we want to do for now is just return a very simple string, hello world. And we're going to return a JSON version of that data. So let's see if this will run or if it will still fail because there's something it doesn't like.
I think you got to rename it something else than Flask. I think you got to name it like app.py
Really?
or server.py. I think.
That's interesting because the run through I did yesterday, I named
No.
my file flask-server.py, but oh, and I named it Flask right now. Whoops. I see what you're saying. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna rename this file, and let's see. I think I could do a move to a new name, Flask server dot py ls. Yep, my file is updated. And now let's try running this file. Oof, I'm using port 8000 in one of my other terminals. Let's see, it's probably this one. Okay, let's also just, let's deactivate, just deactivate. And let's see, where are we? Let's try this again. Finally, we have a Flask server running. Let me drag this over. Also, let me make sure I can see the chat because I've been missing these messages. There you go. Thank you again, Kendra, for catching that. All right, so we have hello world. And if I were to comment this out like I wanted to and refresh, or maybe it doesn't want to. Let me just click on this again. It's still showing. Oh, because this is flask.py, I got to reopen my file. So I'm going to code flask server.py. Now I could comment this out, save, but I turn off my okay, now if we look, well, it says it's not found. And that's because we haven't set a route to go to this path. So let's save that. Let's toss that back in. Let's also grab another Zeech terminal so I can actually do stuff in here. Am I in the right place? I'm gonna go to Flask 2. And then I'm going to say source bin activates. Cool. So now that we've created this view, let's create another view, a view for creating students. And let's start by just creating some mock dummy data, right? So we're going to do an array of students and, well, an array of objects that represent students. And then we're going to say, we're going to create another route. Actually, just so a little more organized, I want the routes to be next to each other. Let's do app.route. And this time, let's make the path something like students. And here we're going to find another method. And if you are not following along, I think it shouldn't be too hard to catch up and follow along. Should have mentioned that from the beginning, but whoops, I always forget that part. Let's do return JSONify students. So what this is going to do once we actually finish this is run a request to get the students. So let's leave it as is, and let's visit that path. We can see our students. And if we look at our server, we see that get students was hit when I passed in that URL to my browser. So when we land on this page, we're calling this function. But there's another way to do this. Let's say we wanted some more complex functionality, right? We don't just want this to render only when the user lands on it. Maybe instead we want this to render when it's called by another part of the application, in which point we're going to have to convert this into a GET request. So it's basically REST API methods, and it's going to be GET. So now, if we were to, I think if we were to, yeah, it looks like we would still get the data, I think, if we, hello world, students, yep, we still get the data. So it's still calling this, but now we can also curl request. So let's do curl -x to specify the type of request you want to make. In our case, we are making a GET request, and we are going to HTTP localhost, also known as 127.0.0.1, and our port. And then we're going to pass in the path that we want to hit. So let's see what that does. It returns all the student objects. So now I could plug in I could write any method or whatever, what have you, in my application that will make this curl request, and it's basically going to hit this route. And that's pretty much it for doing requests. Now let's try to set this up with Postgres. So if you're following along, you might need a few minutes to create a Postgres database. So while I give you some time to do that, let's look at what that Postgres database looks like. So can anyone tell me how I can check my databases from Bash?
I mean, if you're using Postgres, you just do pSQL, right? And then you can look into them.
Mm-hmm. So I could go into the pSQL terminal and do that, yes. But if I wanted to use Bash, because I, for whatever reason, wanted to save myself 2 seconds from hopping in the terminal, I could just pass in the command using -c from my terminal. And let's just do a simple \L to list everything. It's going to list all my databases. And I see that I have a student database. So let's look at what that looks like. Now, when I do this, I'm going to have to specify what database I want to run this command on, right? So is it students or students? I think it's students. So let's do that, and let's run \D for detail, and we're going to run this on T for tables. Cool. So this is my student table. I have basically, I guess, names on it. I feel like there should be more columns in there. So maybe if I do can someone tell me how I want to, how to get my columns from this table? I always forget to. Let's see. Well, what about instead of getting our columns, let's just go into the database. So we're doing the inevitable. Post pSQL, want to go to students. I'm in students. If I do a select all from student, then we'll be able to see all our data, which in effect will tell us what columns we have. So I've got IDs, first names, last names, ages, and grades. So that is my database. If you're following along, you should have the SQL commands available to run so that you could set this up and be right where I'm at. They are also collapsed, so if you wanted to try and remember the commands without seeing them, then you could do that too. All right, so now that we've done this, we have our SQL database. Now let's try to actually match this data inside of our Flask application. So the first thing we're going to need to do now is to create a student model that will represent this data. So we have 5 columns, and that's what we want to do. We want to specify a model that's going to have all of these columns. We'll get rid of the students array in a bit because we'll no longer need it, but we're going to create a students model by setting up a class and calling db.model. Oh, I think I'm missing. Am I missing something? Yes, I am. We got to do a bit of additional setup first, especially because I'm starting a fresh new project from scratch. So I created a virtual environment. I don't have anything installed except for Flask. We're going to need 2 dependencies. One is Flask -SQL Alchemy, which is basically a library for that gives you access to some functionality that will help you connect to a Postgres database easily. So let's install that. And then we'll install our second dependency, scicop G2, which, man, it's basically a library that facilitates seamless communication between Python and that Postgres SQL database. Essentially, just like Alchemy, it's going to give us some out-of-the-box ways to interact with our Postgres SQL database. So this is going to be pip install scicop G2 binary. You could either do the regular version or the binary version. If you're doing something simple like running through a demonstration project, for example, go ahead with the binary. It's a lot smaller and it has all the basic functionality you need and does not require any additional setup. So, all right, we run that. It's good to go. Let's now import these. And that's going to look like Flask SQL Alchemy. Import SQL Alchemy. Cool.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Yeah, so by additional setup, would that just be that when you set up your server, like base URL, your route, that you don't have to identify that you're using the newest version, like when you use version 3? Or is there other setup that you would?
Are you saying
With
for
PG?
Are you asking why we're not using 3?
Yep. And also on top of that, like if by additional setup you mean that we would have to specify that in the file, or
Oh,
what other additional file or what other additional things would you have done otherwise?
right. Okay. Let me grab this document from yesterday because I need a refresher on this. Oh no, it's not this one. I think we will be using scicop G3 for Django.
Yeah, I was just curious. I know they mentioned both of them, but then they kind of like in you'll see they pushed towards using 3, and I just didn't know if there's still like relevance to using 2, and when using 3, if there's any specific reason why we should use one or the other.
Okay. As to why we're using 2, I honestly don't have a good reason. I think it might have just been when this lesson was written, could have been that. It could just be maybe it is faster to install. But we will be using scicop G3 for for the Django portion. And here, let's look at this. If to install, yeah. Because we're only just starting, you should use scicop G2 binary only. Don't install scicop G2 at all, and certainly don't install both packages. Basically, scicop G2 works out of the box, and there are prerequisites to using scicop G2. So let's see if we could find those prerequisites. There we go. So the prerequisites to scicop G2, oh no, it's gone. Well, so much for that. I'm sure we could find this documentation somewhere. But yeah, that's basically the short and simple, maybe incomplete answer. It allows us to bypass a lot of additional setup. Maybe not a lot, I don't know. But it's
Okay.
faster.
No, that works for me. I was just curious. And
Cool.
I just saw this person might even notice that there's a regular scicop G or scicop G2 and binary. Like I didn't even know they're two separate things. So it's kind of interesting.
Okay, cool. All right, so now with that that done, I think we need to, oh yeah, we got to add we just imported Flask SQL Alchemy from, or sorry, we just imported SQL Alchemy from Flask SQL Alchemy. Now we got to use it. So let's say first db equals SQL Alchemy, and we're going to pass it in the app that we created. I think we're also going to need a config. So app.config, and I think, I don't know how to elaborate on this part. So, I mean, this line is basically configuring the app to use the Postgres SQL database. It might just be how this package is written. This is the syntax it wants us to use. This is the value it wants us to pass in. And then we're going to create a long string for other things. Like we want to say, for example, we want to use PostgreSQL, and then we're using PostgreSQL plus scicop G. And then we use our, in my case, this is the Postgres user that I have on my local machine. And I think I could just pass in password. And then we're going to do localhost and students. Oh, no, I don't want password in there because I don't want to use my password. I'm just going to get rid of that entirely. So with this, I should be able to get into the SQL database with just my username. So, okay, with that, we were writing the student class. So now that we've imported this, we could use db.model to create our student model. So let's go ahead and match the values that we saw in our database. So that was going to include ID, first name, last name, age, and grade. So first things first, ID. This is going to be a new column. So we use db.column. We want it to be an integer, so we say db.integer, and then we say primary key equals true. Then we want to do the first name, which is going to utilize db column again. These are all going to use that. And this one's going to be a string. And we can pass in a parameter, an argument to this to specify the maximum character limit. We're going to do something similar with last name, so we could just copy paste and leave it like that. And then we say age db.column. It's going to be another integer. We don't need it to be a primary key. And then the last thing we need is a grade. So db.column another db.string. This time it's a letter grade, so we only need one character. And I am missing the colon, so let's add that back in there. And now we can go back to our students route and we can get rid of this because we're no longer using this hard-coded data. So let's now define a new method. We'll just call it getStudents again. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the student class that we created, which is using DB model, to call a query. And we're going to request everything. So we want to use all. So similar to how inside of our Postgres SQL terminal, we're saying select all from student, we're saying select all here. So now we want to create a students list so that we could house these values. And we're going to essentially create the format for these students, or recreate the format so that we could display this. So ID is going to be the student.id, and first name, oh, I called it students. Why is it complaining about that? Okay, I guess it's student.id. I got to update the README. I think that's a mistake there. First name is going to be students.firstname. Last name is, as you probably guessed, students.lastname. And age is students.age. And I think, what else do we need? We need the grade. So a grade is going to be student.grade. Okay. Now, for student in students, oh, that's why. Okay, I see. So let's go back here and correct these. I think these were supposed to just be student. Okay. All right, are we missing anything else? We are missing our return statement. So this students list is basically going to be a list that we run a for loop in, where we, for every entry inside of students, the results from this query, we're going to create this kind of object. So now let's do a return. We're going to use JSONify to make our data visible from our front end or our browser. And actually visible from the browser as well as our GET request. So let's Control D out of that. This should be good to go. And now we could call it again. So we were using a curl request. Let's do that again. Let's make sure we're connected to the server. Ooh. All right, SQL Alchemy database URI or SQL Alchemy mines must be set. So where I say SQL equals DB equals SQL Alchemy app, did I misspell anything? Oh, yeah, I said data abuse. Whoops, let's correct that typo. Let's try that again. Oof, now we have a new error. Can't load the plugin, SQL Alchemy, Dialects, Postgres, SQL, Psychogy. So I am missing a P in here. Because I can't type apparently. And now let's try again. And we are good to go. We are running. So let's go ahead, try our curl request again. And now we have our students, the same students that we see in the SQL database. All right, any questions about this? Okay, cool. So today we have, oh, I want to know if you guys could access this. So anybody just click on one of these assignments. As you could see, the format is a little different from how it's been these past few weeks because we just had a meeting last week about standardizing the format and making all the curriculums look alike. So this is how it's going to look from now on. And I'll go ahead and fix the older modules at some point, but I want to make sure that you all have access to Platoon assignments. So can a few of you try this out?
I'm getting a links not found, Julius.
Okay. I'm guessing, I wonder if it's just because it's not completed yet. Yeah, I'll fork all of these over then to Platoon DevOps. So yeah, let's do that. I'll fork these over to Platoon DevOps. Breakout rooms are open. We're done with lecture. So go ahead, take a 15-minute break, and we will reconvene at 9 o'clock.
Okay, I think I'll need the video on this one. Will you post that? Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.